the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has used a trip to Washington, D.C. to finalise the upcoming budget as he attends talks with economic leaders. He's also reiterated warnings of recession risk and implications for Australia's economy.
I think there's a pretty broad expectation around the world that there's a big risk of recession here in the United States.
Well, joining us live now is the political scientist from the Australian National University, Dr. Charles Miller. Dr. Miller, thank you for your time. Joe Biden seems to be suggesting the US can avoid a recession, a political rhetoric we can understand ahead of the upcoming midterms. Our Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, seems to have a very gloomy outlook on the US economy. Presumably they're getting the same advice.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it's a difficult situation right now because we have a twin risk essentially in the global economy. On the one hand, there's a continuing problem with inflation across the developed world, and the standard response to that obviously is to hit the brakes and to increase interest rates, cut budget deficits and so on in order to try and bring that under control. The more you do that, the more the danger that you incur of having a recession. And so basically it's on a knife edge in many ways for many of the policymakers around the world. And so therefore I can understand, to be honest, why people would look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions. But I think that there is a very strong reason why Jim Chalmers would want to be pushing this line when he's coming to Washington, D.C.
Speaking of the midterms, what are the major issues at play as we get closer and closer?
Well, I mean, the major issues at play in the United States, I mean, initially it was inflation. So, I mean, obviously inflation is a major problem across the world right now. But in the United States, it's becoming particularly acute. And so that's the reason why the Federal Reserve has been tightening monetary policy. And therefore, according to many other states in the global economy, exporting inflation to other places. But the Federal Reserve's remit is basically just to look after the American economy, hit its inflation targets, and so on. But, you know, inflation is still a major problem there, and that's one of the major bread and butter issues in the United States. Another issue, however, which is actually counteracting the negative effects on the Democrats of inflation, is the issue of abortion. So obviously, since the Supreme Court's ruling overturning Roe versus Wade, this is basically introduced a genuine prospect of a potential Republican-controlled House of Representatives bringing about some kind of federal ban. It's also introduced, that some states have been able to introduce a ban on abortion at the state level. And so this has really mobilized female voters and liberal voters behind the Democrats and has actually proved to be something which has counteracted to a large degree the negative effects of inflation on the Democratic vote.
And so when we look at the polls, what are they suggesting in terms of how things might pan out, what the overall results might look like?
Well, look, the polls right now, from what I can see, I mean, you know, the polls are predictive to some extent, but I mean, the best forecasters in the business, the likes of 538, that's Nate Silver, are basically saying that the likelihood is that the Democrats will retain the Senate, but there's an even stronger likelihood that the Republicans will take the House of Representatives. I mean, again, you know, these are not cast iron guarantees, but that looks like the most likely outcome. So Biden will still have the Senate under the control of his party, but the House of Representatives will go to the Republicans.
The former president, Donald Trump, is still making headlines on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis in the US. What is the view within the Republican Party as to whether he is the right person to have another go to lead again at the next US election?
To be perfectly honest, I think that he's still the favourite. The Trump faction in the Republican Party is just getting stronger and stronger, and his opponents are getting weaker and weaker. So we saw the Liz Cheney, obviously, who's the kind of the leader of the anti-Trump camp in the Republican Party. Obviously, she will no longer be representing Wyoming, and so therefore, basically, this is sending a chilling message to any Republicans who want to stand against Donald Trump, and it's emboldening his supporters to further complete their takeover of the the Republican Party. Now, there has been a lot of talk about Ron DeSantis as a potential alternative. He's somebody who has very similar politics to Trump, but without some of the indiscipline and the controversy and the controversial social media use and so on that Donald Trump had. So he's a credible alternative, but I think that at this stage, Trump is still the favourite to be the Republican nominee again in 2024.
Gosh, it's always a fascinating sport watching US politics. Dr. Charles Miller, really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much for your time.